combined with his very, very hoarse voice, seemingly coming from a disembodied Costello, led everybody to think, and I think quite properly, that the man was guilty as sin.
Have you always upheld the Constitution and the laws of your state and nation?
I believe I have.
Have you ever offered your services to any war effort of this country?
No.
Bearing in mind all that you have gained and received in wealth, what have you ever done for your country as a good citizen?
Paid my tax.
The two-day barrage of questions drained Costello. Finally, he said he'd answer no more.
You refuse to testify further?
Absolutely. I'm not going to answer another question because I'm not under arrest and I'm going to walk out.
And he did. Costello was cited for contempt.
His worst fear was realized when he was unmasked for what he was. You know, a mafia leader in disguise, uptown.
The contempt charges got Costello an 18-month sentence. For the first time since 1915, he was going back to prison. The government was not finished. It moved to deport the 63-year-old Costello to Italy for lying on his naturalization papers. Then came tax evasion charges.
His lawyer, Ed Williams, told him that he was claiming to be old and sick, and, you know, here he looked great in these well-tailored suits. And Williams supposedly said, you know, get the suits made too big so you look like you're shrinking in them and you're not well. And he reportedly said, Counselor, I'd rather blow the case.
He did. The court sentenced Costello to 5 years in prison and a $30,000 fine. He turned himself in to the U.S. Marshals on May 14, 1956.
How about your business affairs? Are you leaving them in charge of anyone?
I have no comments to make. I believe that's enough for the day.
All right, thanks.
Just 10 months later, Costello got out on appeal. His freedom would nearly cost him his life. Costello's longtime rival, Vito Genovese, wanted Costello dead so that he could take over the crime family.
Genovese was particularly enraged at the way everybody kept saying how Frank knew how to handle things, how he knew how to make money, how he kept things on an even keel. All these things just drove Genovese crazy. And that's when he ordered the hit on Costello.
May 2nd, 1957. Costello spent the evening at Monsignore Restaurant with his wife and friends. They included Phil Kennedy, who managed a modeling agency, and John and Cindy Miller. John was a gossip columnist for the National Enquirer. His wife was pregnant at the time, and Costello patted her stomach for good luck. Frank later became godfather to Cindy's second child, John Jr.
He did not want to go back to prison. He did not want to be sent back to Italy. He was intensely patriotic. Frank was very worried.
In what was becoming a new facet of his daily routine, Frank cut short his evening to go home and phone his lawyers. Frank shared a taxi with his friend Phil Kennedy around 11 p.m. As Costello's taxi pulled up to his apartment building, a hulking figure emerged from a limousine, rushed into the lobby, and waited. He was Vito Genovese's bodyguard and chauffeur, Vincent the Chin Gigante.
Vincent the Chin pointing straight at Costello with his arm stretched out like this, with a gun in his hand, says, "This is for you, Frank," and fires. He was 6 to 12 feet away. Costello staggers, blood flows from his head, you know, and he starts to sink to the floor. Gigante runs, certain that he's killed him.
The bullet grazed the top of his fedora, separating the brim from the body of the hat and causing a graze wound across the side of Costello's skull. Frank put his hand to his head, and he saw the blood, and he later remarked to somebody he thought the bullet might still be in there. Phil Kennedy appeared and hailed a cab, And Kennedy said Roosevelt Hospital and step on it.
The cab driver spoke to reporters the next morning.
Who was in the cab? Frank, I recognize Frank Costello because the fellow said, Frank, he says, don't worry about it. He says, we're taking you right to the nearest hospital. And so I turned around and I looked and I says, aren't you Frank Costello? And he says, gee. So I said, mind your own business. Who said that? Kennedy.
While doctors treated Costello, a detective found slips in his pockets that showed casino earnings at the Tropicana, evidence of the mob's hold on Vegas. Evidence that would come back to haunt Costello in his tax evasion case. When the cops questioned Costello after his release from the hospital, he refused to tell them who had fired the bullet that nearly killed him. I don't know who could have done it, Costello maintained. I haven't an enemy in the world. Vincent Gigante went into hiding, but turned himself into police a month later.
Vinny, did you give yourself up because you were afraid?
No, you're crazy.
Costello knew that Vito Genovese was behind the shooting, but Costello did not want to go to war.
When he got shot in the head, he literally said, why do I need these headaches? Rather than start a war and tear apart this mob, these families that I worked so hard to put together, to bind together, to have diplomacy among, I would rather step out, relinquish my own power, than to tear this apart.
Costello demonstrated his loyalty to the mob, even when it involved the man who had tried to kill him. At Gigante's trial, Frank refused to identify him. Gigante was found not guilty.
Gigante walked across the courtroom, stuck out his hand, said, "Thanks, Frank," and Frank Costello took it. I think this was Costello's way of saying to Genovese, all right, I'm alive, I'll move out, you're now the new leader, and it was his way of making a public resignation.
Even though Frank had retired from the mob, Genovese was still suspicious of him and his closest ally and street muscle, Albert Anastasia. On October 25, 1957, at the Park Sheraton Hotel, as Anastasia leaned back in a barber's chair for his morning shave, Vito's henchmen gunned him down. Back at the Majestic, Costello's attorney found his client with Anastasia's brother. They were sobbing. Costello said, "This means I'm next." Before that could happen, a court reaffirmed Costello's conviction for tax evasion. The Prime Minister was shipped back to prison to finish out his sentence. Vito Genovese was about to join him there, bringing their lifelong feud to prison and nearly causing a riot. In 1959, Frank Costello brokered the most important deal of his life. He had spent a year in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary when his bitter rival, Vito Genovese, became his fellow inmate. Genovese had been convicted of drug trafficking and sentenced to 15 years. Their feud threatened to escalate into a full-out prison war. Costello arranged a prison sit-down with Genovese and worked out a truce. True to form, the Prime Minister had set aside his true feelings for Genovese in order to play the diplomat.
He hated Genovese, though. He said, that son of a bitch, he says. He tried to put me down. You try to put me down, you better put me down.
Costello got the ultimate revenge. Genovese would die behind bars a decade later. Costello's sentence, on the other hand, came to an end on June 30th, 1961, but he still faced a deportation hearing.
Frank, during those years in Atlanta, did you sit around making plans, do a lot of thinking?
I'm always thinking.
About what, Frank?
How do you feel about this deportation thing, going back to Italy?
Well, I don't want to make no comments on it now, especially you understand.
Would you rather remain in this country?
Naturally, I would.
And if you stay, what do you plan to do?
I'm retired.
Costello would not have to go back to Italy after all. The U.S. Supreme Court threw out the deportation order against him. Costello resumed holding court at the Waldorf, where new mob leaders like Charlie the Blade Tureen would seek his advice. The Prime Minister picked up a new moniker he cherished, Uncle Frank.
He was pretty much off the police radar screen because they knew he was inactive. He had made his fortune, and he had hidden his money, and he really didn't need to work. And I think he was, you know, living the waning years of the sportsman's life.
Frank relaxed at his Long Island estate. He cultivated roses, which he entered in local competitions. As always, Costello preferred socializing with people outside the mob, like the actor Anthony Quinn.
That's the main thing about Frank. I don't think, he didn't want to tell me about that. I was, you know, and one day I was riding in the back of the truck, and there's and the gun went. He didn't want to talk about that. He wanted to find new horizons, new vistas.
In New York, Costello remained a celebrity and a living legend based on his criminal past. Author Peter Moss approached Frank to write a biography.
Basically, I said, you want to leave you here, footprints in the sand of time. And he liked that. Then I said, I think this is so important. I think I get the biggest advance anybody has gotten for a nonfiction book. And I did. He never asked for a penny.
Moss and Costello met 11 times, the first 7 occasions in Moss's apartment.
Everybody knew who he was. When he left the apartment, I walked downstairs and the doorman turned around to me and said, he said, there's the real Godfather.
After a year and a half of discussions, Costello finally consented to writing his biography with Moss. But just 10 days later, on February 18, 1973, the author got bad news.
Charlie the Blade Tureen called me and he just said, he's gone, and hung up the phone. I didn't have to ask who.
Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld, had died of a heart attack.
At the age of 82, he had found himself. He could say, I know what it means now to be alive, with all its responsibilities and problems. Still, I've earned a good night's sleep.
In keeping with Costello's last wishes, his funeral was a small affair. Only 50 mourners, most of whom had nothing to do with the mafia. He was buried at St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens. As a priest gave a short prayer, his wife Bobby and her brother paid their last respects. Even in his grave, Costello made headlines. A year after his death, an explosion rocked his mausoleum. A mobster named Carmine Galante was behind the bombing. He had just gotten out of prison for narcotics and was about to take over as boss of the Bonanno crime family.
This was his message, saying, all the old bets are off. And Frank Costello was the very symbol of the old bosses. He was the symbol of the old ways that shunned dealing narcotics, that said there was a certain code. And this was Galante's way of spitting in the face of the old ways.
But as time went by, the mob faced greater scrutiny from law enforcement and more internal strife. Frank Costello's reign as boss would come to be seen as a golden era.
I don't think there will ever be another sitting boss who can meet with judges and political bosses and have the kind of unbridled influence. That's something that happened under Frank Costello in New York for just one era.
He is certainly the only major figure in the mob who I believe could have been a huge success legitimately. You keep hearing, you know, how smart they are if they'd only taken another road. He's the only one I ever met.
He once said in so many words